Okay, so coming back to the slide deck, this is money supply slide. So what, after all these definitions of money, M0, M1, M2, M3, what are we going to talk about? So when we say money supply for our modeling, what we mean is M1, basically, currency and checkable deposits. And the money supply is controlled by the central bank in pretty much every country through open market operations, which is sales and purchases of treasury bonds in exchange for currency. And that determines the amount of currency in circulation. So when Federal Reserve sells the treasury bonds, it withdraws cash from circulation in exchange for those treasury bonds. It keeps them in the basement, and that doesn't count as part of the money supply because the money cannot be used for purchases unless the Fed puts it back in the circulation. So that controls M0. And the reserve policy, how much reserves the commercial banks are required to hold with the central bank, controls the multiplier and therefore controls the amount of M1. So we are going to take money supply as given without really talking about the details of how the central bank is making those decisions. And we'll talk a little bit more about the reserve requirements as we discuss China, for example, that uses it quite frequently. So we have money supply that's determined by the central banks. Money demand is determined by individuals, people like you. And the individuals are, how much money they demand depends on a few factors. So interest rate on deposits, obviously, if the interest rate on deposits is higher, you're going to choose to hold less cash and keep more money on your deposits. So maybe instead of withdrawing everything you have in your checking account, you're going to leave some so that they can earn some interest if the interest is substantial. Another factor is risk, in particular inflation, but there are also other risks, and all assets have risks. So think about, if you don't want to hold cash, what can you hold? Putting money in a bank also has a risk because maybe the bank is going to collapse, but also those are subject to inflation unless you're going to purchase inflation indexed bonds or invest in the account that is indexed for inflation. So hyperinflation, however, makes people hold very little money, and frequently they just exchange their money for foreign currency that is not subject to such inflation. They hold very little of their currency money. Regular rates of inflation doesn't have that much effect on the money demand. If you think about if inflation changes from 1.5% to 2% in the US, are you going to withdraw different amount of money from ATM every time you go to it, or are you going to withdraw the same? Most likely it's going to be the same. You wouldn't even know whether inflation rate is 1.5 or 2, unless you major in economics, perhaps. Another factor that affects the holdings of money is its liquidity. Money is the most liquid asset, and that's really the main benefit of holding money. You can always get rid of it, and you can always use the money to obtain some other assets if you want to. You cannot always do it with other assets that they compensate you for the lack of liquidity with a higher interest. So there is a trade-off. So aggregate money demand is a little bit different from your individual money demand because that's what the whole economy wants to hold in terms of M1, and that is affected by interest rate. The higher is the interest rate, the less is the demand for money because you want to keep money in the bank. It's also affected by the price level. Think about if all the prices go up, say if all the prices double, you basically are going to need to double the amount of money in your pocket in order to be able to buy the same stuff you bought before. And it's also affected by the real national income, how much stuff there is to buy. So the higher is the price level, the more money people are going to want to hold. And the more stuff the economy is producing, the more money people would want to hold because there is more stuff to buy with the money. And that pretty much holds true in the data. So if we want to plot money demand or demand for real money balances, which is the money demand divided by price level. We can plot it as the function of interest rate. And just as always in economics, we flip the axis. So x, the independent variables on the vertical axis and dependent variables on the horizontal axis. So the higher is the interest rate, the less money you're going to want to hold. And if output increases, you're going to want to hold more money at the same given interest rate, right? So say if, let me pick the laser here. If say this is the initial equilibrium, with this interest rate, people want to hold this much of real money balances, which we denote as L, and then output increases with the same interest rate, we now want to hold more money balances. So think of this as a shift of this curve to the right. And remember now from your microeconomics, the difference between changes in demand and changes in the quantity demanded. So when the interest rate changes, because it's on the axis, we're moving along the curve. So that's the change in the quantity demanded. And when output changes, because it's not on the axis, it's some other dimension, the only way we can reflect it in the interest rate real money balances dimension is by shifting the curve. So we shift the curve out when output increases in response to, and that's the increase in demand rather than quantity demanded. All right. Moving on. So now we're ready to define the money market equilibrium by combining money supply and demand for real money balances. And since we have M over P on the axis here, we're going to also put money supply divided by the price level, so the real money supply, and make it equal to the demand for real money balances. So, and remember, money supply is exogenous, so it doesn't depend on anything. It depends on what central bank wants to do. So it's just the vertical line as a function of interest rate, because it doesn't change no matter what the interest rate is. And so here, in this case, point 1 is an equilibrium, where money supply is equal to money demand. The price level is the same for both. Or you can say the money supply divided by price level is equal to the real money balances. So what happens if, for example, the economy is outside of equilibrium? Say initially interest rate is below equilibrium, so in point 2. So individuals then are going to want to hold more money because the interest rate is low. But there isn't that much money. There is only a given money supply. So they want to borrow in order to hold more money. As they want to borrow, they bid up the interest rate until it goes to the equilibrium, right? So we're always, if you want to see where the economy actually is in terms of money and interest rate, if people want to be at point 2, they can't be. They're actually here at this little red dot, and the economy is going to adjust to point 1 because the money supply is given by the central bank, and it just can't be changed unless the central bank changes it exogenously. So one thing I wanted to discuss a little bit is, I think will help you understand the open market operations, is how return on assets and price of assets and the interest rate are related. So the Fed, for example, is not going, it's announcing the target interest rate, but it's really achieving this interest rate by buying and selling US treasuries and by providing overnight credit to the primary dealers at the federal funds market. But let's just think in terms of the bonds. So suppose the price of the bond is P, then you can compute the return on a 1-year bond as how much you get back in 1 year, PT plus 1, minus how much you paid, divided by how much you paid. So it's a percentage increase in the value of the bond over the year that you own it, so that we can simplify it like this. And so the interest rate you make on a bond is 1 plus I, so that's the interest rate. That's equal to the price a year from now divided by price today. So it's basically a percentage increase in the value. It's the interest rate that you make on the bond. Now, see how it's related to the price. So the price a year from now is given. either it's just a face value of the bond, or it's just something you can't affect today in any case. So if today the price of the bond falls, you can see the return is going to increase because they're inversely related. Why is that? Because you get the same amount tomorrow, but if today you pay less, then it means you get higher return during the year that you own an asset. So remember this, the price of an asset and the return of the asset move in the opposite directions, and that's going to resolve some of the confusion that's bound to arise as you think about those issues. So to increase the interest rate, the Fed can sell bonds that we already have on our balance sheet, and that's going to push the bonds down, right? We increase supply, the price goes down, and that automatically increases the interest rate. Okay, this is going to be the end of part 3. We're going to be back with the experiments.